PowerPoint presentations from all the speakers will be made available tomorrow on our website. And please feel free to live tweet. We're on Twitter and Weibo, and it's at SOPA Asia. Thank you.
Thank you. With very little rigmarole and a man who needs very little introduction, Keith Bradsher about his coverage of Typhoon Haiyan. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. Just to set the scene first, let's start with a video. This is the video here. Let's start with a video. This is one where the way the New York Times made this was that I dictated the voice, actually while sitting on a piece of broken plasterboard in the edge of the destroyed airport in Tacloban. I uploaded that on my sat phone, and then they combined it with the video and photo images that they were getting from various sources from the scene. Melissa Kim did that in New York. And this was sort of a way to try to provide an image of what were the problems at the time in Tacloban, but I think it's also useful to start with this to talk about what were the challenges for reporters, challenges that some of you might face if you end up covering a natural disaster like this. So here it just takes 2 minutes, and I'll do it right now. This is Keith Bradsher for the New York Times in Tacloban, the Philippines. The city of Tacloban in the east-central Philippines has been devastated by wind and water, the result of one of the most powerful typhoons ever recorded in the Pacific. Driven by sustained winds of more than 140 miles an hour, the ocean rose almost like a tsunami, so that within minutes, homes hundreds of yards inland had their ground floors submerged in seawater, and water swirled waist-deep through the second floors for those houses that had second floors at all. Many died not just in single-story homes, but in churches, schools, a sports stadium, and other buildings that had been chosen as wind-resistant evacuation centers, but proved to be death traps when they began filling with water. Uncovered bodies still lie along the roads here, and the roads themselves are hard to recognize because they are so clogged with debris. Relief efforts are slow and halting, with even the Filipino soldiers complaining of limited supplies of fresh water. Food is scarce, and residents complain that the smell of rotting human flesh is so severe in some areas that they cannot bring themselves to eat meals in their own homes. Widespread looting over the weekend has made matters worse. People are showing up at the airport begging for food, water, and scarce seats aboard flights out of the shattered city. It does not help that there are virtually no lights at night in the entire city, as even backyard generators were flooded. Improvements may be slow. That said, the Philippines is trying, with American help and assistance from nonprofits, to fly in more aid, a slow and costly alternative to bringing in supplies by road. So that was just a brief overview of the situation. It was an extremely sad event for the people of the Philippines. All of us as journalists were deeply impressed by the way they handled it. As for the reporting side, which is the subject of today's workshop, this was a story that produced extreme challenges in many ways, even by the standards of disaster reporting. Now, if you looked at, for example, Hurricane Katrina, what did the New York Times do for that? We basically were able to base our reporters outside of New Orleans and have them drive in. Some reporters even were driving in from Baton Rouge every day, 90 minutes in, 90 minutes out. But you were able to base your reporters in places that had electricity, had phone lines, air conditioning even, a lot of those comforts. In the case of Tacloban, you didn't have that, and it made it an extremely challenging story for news organizations to cover. To give you an idea of the devastation, the problem with Tacloban, even compared to, for example, also the Indian Ocean tsunami, was that it was a combination of the storm surge, the sea level rose as much as 30 feet, combined with extreme wind damage farther in. So, for example, for the Indian Ocean tsunami, people based themselves in houses just beyond the point where the water reached, and all of those houses weren't damaged. Pretty soon they had electricity. There were better conditions. In the case of Tacloban, you really had to base yourself in a place in the devastation. One of the figures that shows you just how terrible it was in the case of Katrina is I later got a number from the electricity cooperative for that area, that out of 57,000 buildings they were providing electricity to prior to the storm, 6,000 disappeared entirely in the storm. 50,000 were damaged, and under 1,000 survived to the point that if they had electricity, they would have been able to connect them. Now, as it happens, it also took out almost all of the poles, and it also took out the geothermal plant that was the source of electricity for the whole island. So they did not get electricity really properly for months. So we had a lot of logistical issues in terms of how to cover it. Now, I'd like to open it to some of you, and then I'll sort of show you some of the issues that we thought about. What are some of the issues you can see here just from this video that would be challenges for a reporter if you were, for example, to arrive at the airport right after the storm? In my case, also, I was one of the first reporters in, but all we could bring was a small day pack, which meant you were very limited in terms of what you could carry. There was a small propeller plane. There were, the airport was completely crippled, and that was all that could land there, so you couldn't get jets or any larger capacity, just for weight reasons. All you could carry was 5 kilos in a small day pack going in. So what are the issues that you see here in terms of coverage challenges, logistical issues in particular? Anybody?
How do you transmit your story?
Okay, communications, that's one. Next.
Transportation.
Transportation, that's two. Next. Food, that's another, exactly. The biggest problem none of you have mentioned yet. Keep going.
Lodging.
Sorry?
Lodging.
Lodging, another one. Electricity, another one. Diseases, another one. I'll just briefly actually depart on that. Diseases were not a problem, with one exception. The reason is you have to distinguish natural disasters from epidemics. With Ebola, you had a big concern about dead bodies, but people who, because they are, you can get disease from the bodies. But in the case of a natural disaster, people who die of natural causes the bodies are not especially dangerous. You don't have a big worry necessarily about about epidemics. With one exception, the biggest concern you have is what disease should you always be vaccinated against before you go into one of these situations? And we absolutely required it in the New York Times. Tetanus, exactly. I saw tetanus cases after Typhoon Haiyan in Toploban. One of the hazards you had was that everything was covered in palm fronds or debris, and you were clambering over the debris just to walk around. In terms of transportation, there was none. You had to walk everywhere. And you were always trying to figure out, was there a nail in a board underneath that palm frond, and where is it going to go through your foot? Or your hand if you were clambering. So it was very easy to get injuries that might be a problem in terms of tetanus. So you did need to have a tetanus vaccine, but diseases otherwise not a big issue. Nobody yet has mentioned the biggest worry.
Orientation.
Finding, yeah, you did have, fortunately in the case of Toploban, it was all along the water, so you sort of went one direction or the other direction with the water. Yes? Language, yes, in the Philippines, a lot of people do speak English, but yes, and one of the difficulties was that they did not necessarily, we had also, of course, translators, but we also, one difficulty is that they don't speak necessarily Tagalog there either, the national language, they speak the local idiom. So there's a bit of translation issue. We fortunately, we had a fixer who was from that island and spoke Tagalog and the local dialect and English, yes. Safety could be a concern. Well, let me now give you, here are some of the ones that that were concerns. And then I would say the question is, which of these proved to be, in some ways, the biggest concern? Yes. Let me, now you may have seen that there was somebody complaining there's almost no drinking water. All the water, first of all, in terms of any running water, that was all disabled. Water is heavy to bring in, and it was a constant concern. Now, we were very fortunate. The second day, Tyler Hicks arrived. For those of you who don't know his name, he's the world's most famous disaster and war photographer. He's worked for the New York Times for the last 18 years. He's been almost continuously in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Katrina, Indian Ocean, everything. And somehow, even though it was only this little propeller plane, he somehow talked them into allowing him to bring a 5-gallon jug of water on in the bottom and a large plastic box of food. They were easing up somewhat on what you could check, but even then, he was able to bring a lot of supplies, and that really helped. And we were living on that 5-gallon jug of water for the next few days. But by the time we got resupplied, we were drinking the water from our canned peas. We finished that five gallons. And I think everybody had a concern because you could drink, for example, well water, but all the well water was contaminated. You were likely to get sick as a result. So that is, I guess, a portion of the illness issue if you didn't have enough water. So let me just give you what I would use as a ranking here. Communications, that's a tricky one. There were, and I say it's either 7th or 1st. And that depends entirely on whether you had a satellite phone. So if you had a satellite phone, as we did, or several satellite phones, then you didn't have to worry about communications. You could set it up anywhere. If you did not have a satellite phone, you were really, truly stuck. Now, one global news organization actually sent in a team to Tacloban before Typhoon Haiyan. They sent in a reporter and a producer and a cameraman, and they did not bring a satellite phone, unfortunately. And here they had all this footage, and they totally vanished off the map as far as their network was concerned, and in fact their network was then frantically calling everybody. The Philippines government actually sent 2 cabinet ministers to Tacloban because they knew this was going to be a terrible storm. And they lost touch with them. Nobody in Tacloban, incredibly, no media organization and no government organization had a sat phone, with the result that the whole city was cut off entirely, even from people being able to figure out how bad the damage was. So it was hugely important to have communications. One example of what a difference that makes is when I arrived, by sheer coincidence, I started my career as a freight transportation reporter. And I noticed when I arrived at this destroyed airport that it seemed absolutely chaotic. I mean, you had sort of little light propeller planes parked in odd places. I went to check, what are the air traffic control arrangements? And somebody showed me, well, he had a walkie-talkie. That was it. And they would try to radio the planes when they came within range and ask them to take a turn landing. And as a result, we only had a plane landing every hour, hour and a half. They couldn't land jets even though they cleaned enough of the runway. Why? Because all the jetways, which are the trucks that drive up with the staircase that goes up to the door, all those have been swept off into the ocean and disappeared. Why couldn't they then bring in air traffic control? I learned from the first American soldiers and the first Filipino soldiers there that the U.S. had ready to go a truck that would practically land the planes for them. It was a fully independent, self-powered, so you didn't need to worry about a power truck that could, with radar, everything else, that would land the planes. It would provide you a 24-hour capability. They couldn't bring it in. Why? Because they said nobody in the Philippines had yet signed the form, because they were a sovereign country, that would allow the United States to bring in this military equipment. So because I had this sat phone, I immediately emailed one of our Pentagon reporters, who was a friend of mine from when I worked in the Washington Bureau. I said, please tell the Pentagon they've got to have somebody sign this immediately so that we can get that truck in here. And within several hours they did, and the truck arrived immediately. And they were able to start bringing in more. But until then, so it was crucial to have communication. So there were, even after this, even in the following days, there were some reporters who showed up who didn't have a sat phone. And because no phones of any sort would work, literally they ended up coming in and then leaving later the same day, because otherwise they had no way to file a story. It was just totally destroyed. By the way, to give you an idea of how serious the storm was, the figure in the video, which was in the very early stages, said over 140 miles an hour. To give you a comparison, it turned out that the number the Philippines gave, which was 145 miles an hour, was using a peculiar way that they used to calculate it that is not comparable with US wind speeds. They calculated based on the minimum speed, essentially, over a 10-minute period. The US system and the Saffir-Simpson scale, category 1 through 5, is based on 1 minute speed. So if you convert it, the maximum speed they reported was 145, but if you convert that to the international system used in the States, that was 168 miles an hour. Katrina, by comparison, was 100 miles an hour. Then on top of that, it turns out that that 145 was not the peak of the storm because the instruments were destroyed then and they never got the peak of the storm. So the best estimate is probably 185 miles an hour, which is from the satellite estimates. Now, the force of the wind goes up with the square of the speed. Force of mass times velocity squared and all that. So the power of this storm was 4 times that of Katrina. So you were seeing reinforced concrete buildings that were broken by the force of the wind. So that was how totally devastating it was. So that said, let me say, drinking water was our biggest concern. We finally were able to get resupplied. We had Andy Jacobs back in Cebu after going to Samar. And we needed to get a lot of supplies in. We wanted, I think it was 10 5-gallon jugs of water. We wanted 10 5-gallon jerry cans of gasoline. We had a car that we were able to rent from somebody who was abandoning it at the airport and leaving. But it was practically empty. So it got us just into town, and then we had to ditch it for the next week and walk everywhere. And also Tyler went to found a surviving mountain bike and used that. But so we need the drinking water, jerry cans. We need food, of course. Andy Jacobs did something very, very clever. There was a van of supplies, this sort of rolling bomb with all these jerry cans of gasoline, that needed to get from Cebu across on the ferry to Leyte and then drive 100 kilometers across Leyte. And Leyte was a mess. One of the problems that you had to airlift in limited quantities of supplies was that there was a Red Cross convoy of trucks with supplies. And it turned back because it couldn't get through because hungry mobs tried to grab it and steal it and take things because they were hungry. And so it turned back, so you couldn't get in supplies by road. So whom did he find to drive this van? Any guesses? He found 2 motorcycle enthusiasts, big burly guys who only wore sort of tank tops, tattoos and all. And they like to say, we look scarier than anybody else on the road. We didn't have any problems. So they drove in the supplies to us. And after that, we did have food. But food, you don't really need food that quickly. I mean, I lost 12 pounds in 14 days. You don't really know, as long as you're getting some food, you're okay. What you really need within several hours in sort of 90 plus degree Fahrenheit, 30 plus degree Celsius heat is water. You're constantly needing water. So anyway, the priority I would give is number 1, drinking water. Number 2, electricity. For that, you had to go, there were 2 places where you could do it. The City Hall managed to get a generator going, and the airport had a generator going. And you had to go there. There were sort of daisy chains, which is not very good on fire safety. Somebody would have an extension cord. You have to bring your own extension cord. And you'd plug into their extension cord, and you'd have sort of 4 outlets. Somebody else would use one of your 4 to get their extension cord. And you'd end up with a dozen extension cords with various people trying to charge various devices off them. Now, one difficulty then, you did have a bit of a security issue in terms of, I mentioned shelter also. The first night I slept on a piece of plasterboard in the lee of a damaged concrete building, and there was a tropical depression that came through after. So it poured rain, so you have to try to figure out what direction the prevailing wind from, because I chose the side that was in the lee of it. The other side, however, the people there got soaked because it was just torrential rain. And then after that, we went into the town, and we were able to find a damaged hotel with no water, electricity, or anything else, and no security. But it was a place that had beds, which is good. Security, a bit of a concern. Now, really, people are very nice. There was a lot of looting, but there was very little armed activity. So, for example, one of the concerns we did have was that there were 3 prisons within walking distance of the airport in downtown Tacloban with more than 1,000 prisoners. One of them, the maximum security prison in Leyte. They were all broken open by the storm, and all the prisoners escaped. So we had some concern in that regard. I only had one sort of small incident. Walking back from where we were charging the electricity to the damaged hotel, which is about 7 or 8 blocks, I was coincidentally carrying 2 other sack phones in my little black knapsack there. And a half dozen guys in bandanas, and everybody was wearing bandanas because the odor of the smell of the rotting bodies we were not, reporters were not, but I think a lot of local people were, and that made it And they sort of came out of the shade, it was blazing hot, of course, and said to me, do you have any cameras for us? And I didn't have any cameras. So I only sat phones, but I continue to say that. But so I said, no, I'm really sorry, but I don't have any cameras on me. And I just sort of kept walking at a brisk pace and then went back into the tree and didn't bother me. So it was not a big deal. There was a little concern on security, however. There was one memorable story. I remember when we did finally get gasoline, we went into the interior. We were driving along some of these roads through the jungle, and I came across one totally destroyed house. And there was a young woman there with a 6-month-old baby. House had been hit by not one, but 3 different palm trees from different directions, absolutely flattened. And I interviewed her, and she said, oh, where's your husband? And she said, you know, he went into Toploban right before the storm. And I haven't heard from him since. It's now been more than a week. And I felt so sorry for that woman. And I said, beautiful young woman, and just really seemed like adoring her baby, and said, what are we going to do? So I said, okay, perfect, we've been looking for a missing person story. This is the ideal example. We'll get photos of her. And so I said, what is the address of family in Toploban? And she seemed a little reluctant about it, but she gave me the address. So later on, I went to Toploban, and we managed to finding the alley was not very easy. And finally, we reached it. And there, we found a first cousin. And she said, we told her the story, and she said, she told you that? That's not what happened. The woman you talked to was having an affair behind her husband's back with one of the men in the high maximum security prison. When the Typhoon came through, he got out of prison, he got a gun, he went into her house, he chased off the husband, and he must have been hiding behind the building while you were talking to her. Oh man, they kept being stories that turned out, so we did not, now then we had a question. I could not write that story without going back into the middle of nowhere in the jungle again to ask her if it were true and whether she had an armed fugitive hiding behind her house. And that was one case where we did decide there was possibly a security risk to showing up a second time at the same house. So we did not end up writing that story because we felt like we had to follow all the standards we would follow anywhere else in the world in terms of getting comment from everybody involved. So I've already talked about health, food. Again, you're not as hungry when you're running around all day long, and it's unbelievably hot, and when you're staying up half the night anyway writing your story. One difficulty you did have in terms of writing a story is that you didn't have electricity, so I would just sit in a chair outdoors trying to listen because there was sort of an open layout with anybody could wander through because there's no security in the hotel. So, but the good thing was we had a moon that was getting brighter and brighter night by night. And so all the way to reach the full moon about a week and a half after. So I would just I would have my notebook and my computer. You could turn down the brightness on your computer, and your battery will last much longer. And so that's how I write stories. Later there was a Philippine Army major whose wife ended up staying with the Red Cross in the same hotel. And he organized some of the hotel employees, he gave each of them a whistle and a club, a big thick wood branch, and had them at the corners of the hotel and said, whistle if you see people coming in and whack them if you need to or whatever. And that was the beginnings of security, but the first few nights we didn't have that. Anyway, so those are some of the issues there. Here's our staffing. Initially, on that first plane, I went in as a foreign correspondent. We had a Tagalog-speaking photographer from Manila and a fixer. Second day, we had a photographer, that was Tyler Hicks, who was amazing. Day 3, we had another foreign correspondent, another photographer. This was our ramping up. Now, this is a big resource commitment, as you can see. But for this kind of a storm, really our view was you go all in or nothing. There were some organizations that ended up not sending anybody into Toploban because you didn't want to just send in one person. Washington Post, to my knowledge, did not go in at all. But although they might have done an embed later with the U.S. Navy, there ended up being a U.S. Navy task force that showed up about a week later. The drivers and the cook, I already mentioned. Those are the motorcycle. They had a cook, one of them brought along. He was a sort of a fast food stall cook who was a friend of one of the two drivers. The food was grim, but he did cook. Now, one of the great things about the New York Times, the New York Times even has on contract, or had on contract, a medic who was a former Australian commando, brought in all kinds of supplies, everything from sutures to vaccines if we didn't have them, and everything else, and he joined us. And then days 12 to 14, we all left. I left on day 14, I was left out, and but then I made 4 follow-up trips, 3 to Tacloban, and I also went to Manila to interview President Aquino. Finally, the New York Times also offered post-incident counseling. That's a policy at the Times, which is you do get a call from the psychologist asking if you have any issues from having been in this kind of situation for quite a while, then he's free to talk about them. I feel need, but it's important that news organizations offer that on very grim stories. And then finally, I'll give you this is an example of an issue that came up. A police escorted convoy of trucks carrying bodies for a mass burial turns back after hearing gunshots. A leading British newspaper says online that some local residents believe it must have been a guerrilla attack by the New People's Army. That's one of the world's oldest insurgencies. It's been on Leyte Island for 50 years, a Maoist insurgency. Your editor in Hong Kong sent you an email asking about it, so we were getting email on satellite phones. Do you, 1, write a long, potentially frontable, meaning front-page story on the attack as a major development? 2, write a short article mentioning the possibility of a guerrilla attack? 3, do not mention the possibility of a guerrilla attack online or in print while asking local officials for comment and keeping ears open for New People's Army comment, and they never comment, the New People's Army, but anyway. And 4 is number 3, and also discourage other foreign correspondents from jumping on the story to the extent you might see them at the as you're recharging your equipment at one of the 2 power generators. Anybody? 1 to 4, what would you say? 2, I hear 2. What else? Sorry? 4. Anybody else? 3? Okay. I chose 4. Now, I don't normally talk that much with other foreign correspondents, but in this case, I was really concerned about it, because if people had gotten the perception that there was a guerrilla attack issue, then the relief effort really could have slowed to a crawl. If everybody started thinking, oh my goodness, I've got to bring a gun to me, or I've got guards, or something silly like that. There was no credible evidence to me, just sort of guessing because you heard gunshots. What the heck? There were gunshots going off around town anyway. Why would you assume that those particular gunshots were New People's Army? You were not seeing gunshot injuries in the hospitals. I was visiting those. So it was not a question of people actually shooting each other. It was more in the cases of looting, such as in the photo you saw from that people were firing over the heads of them. There was one of possible looters. There was one prison that survived, and it had been damaged, and the guards were sitting in front. It was interesting. They said, okay, the criminals are in charge, the prisoners are in charge in the prison. We're not about to go in there. We sort of pushed some food to the front, but all of us are carrying loaded M16 military assault rifles, and we told the prisoner, if anybody crosses such and such a line, we'll open fire. And they didn't try to escape. So it really was, there were a lot of armed people around, but to assume then that any given gunshots were New People's Army, which did have a history of occasionally shooting at police as they left Tacloban, but there was no evidence for it in this case. And it didn't meet any standard of proof that this was a guerrilla attack, and it would seem to have potentially enormous consequences in the middle of a humanitarian crisis to start suggesting that was the case. So I erred on the side of extreme caution in choosing number 4. And later the government officials said no, in fact it had been gunshots, just people trying to discourage looting. So with that, let me open it up for questions and see what people would like to say, if anything. Yes?
Sorry, you have to speak up.
I'm just young.
Yes, please.
Okay.
Were people, when you spoke to Jen, were very receptive to talking to you, or were they very shocked, disgusted?
They were wonderful, kind people, many of whom wanted to talk about what their experiences have been. People who lost family members often wanted to talk about it. It had been a terrible trauma. They hadn't had a chance to talk to others. I found people surprisingly willing to talk. I think it's very important in these situations to show respect. And so there were a few reporters who were, for example, showing up in shorts and t-shirts. And I actually wore, basically, I wore what I'm wearing today. I mean, I bought white short sleeve shirts, khaki trousers, I had a couple of other shirts. Some of the other journalists joked that I looked like a Mormon missionary. But if in effect you're going to lots of people's funerals, if you're visiting people who lost loved ones, I think it's important to show respect. Now there's also a side health benefit to all of this, which is you really want to be wearing long pants in a disaster area because there is so much debris around. And if you brush past something and it cuts your leg, that can easily become infected and septic, and you don't want to be getting sick in that kind of a situation where there's very little medical care available. So you absolutely need to be wearing long pants. You don't want to be wearing blue jeans because, of course, it is unbelievably hot and humid, and so really khaki trousers are probably your best choice in terms of for a long dress that's going to provide you good injury protection.
I'm interested that people were coming in without sat phones. Was that because they failed to anticipate the situation on the ground, or these were experienced correspondents?
Yes, there were. It varied. There were some of the smaller news organizations did not have a sat phone available. Sat phone is a great thing to have. It is not actually that expensive. It's $1,500. It's sort of a little bit like razors. They charge you for the time. It's like charging for the razor blade, not for the razor handle. They charge you for the satellite time, but not necessarily as much for the initial device. But no, there were people coming in and then heading out immediately if they were not equipped to do this at home. Yes.
Actually, I wondered this when I was reading your stories. I think you covered a man who had a very badly damaged leg, and you went back and tried to find him, and you mentioned he died. I actually just wondered, you probably get asked this a lot, how do you handle the emotional side of that as a reporter?
That was really sad. I am very fortunate that I've not had I've not had a death in my immediate family or my parents, and so this was the first time I'd really been with somebody. And I had a 45-minute interview with him as he lay on a bed at a hospital getting no treatment. He had been triaged that they didn't think they could do much for him. Now, as it turns out, they could have saved him if they'd had proper medical care. He did not even get antibiotics, and he died within a day and a half. They realized how far gone he was as new medical teams showed up, and they amputated his leg, but it was too late, and he died of blood infection. And that was a very powerful and sad story to me. We put the initial story of his lying there in a hallway in a hospital with practically no electricity, no medical care, just a crude village bandage on his leg, not getting any care, and he talked to me about how he had to survive for the sake of his wife and son in the village, and it was baby son. It was a terribly sad story, and I was very moved when I learned that that he had died. I went back 2 days later, and he'd already died, and he just died literally a couple hours earlier, and so I later. So that ended up with being two different front page stories. I did later go into the jungle and into the center of the island, and I found his widow and spoke to her and learned more about it. And I ended up actually helping cover her costs out of my own pocket, and so I was not able to write a follow-up story. So I chose not to do a story. Instead, I helped the family, because that's interfering with the story. It was not then appropriate for me to write a third story, so I've not written further about that family. But it was really, because I mean, I met him and his aunt had been there when I was talking to him in the hospital, and he was, and she was talking about how, boy, that if he goes, there is nothing left for this family, they depend on him, his wife can't do the heavy labor, everything else, and it was a very, very sad experience. But you ended up with a lot of these. I mean, I remember interviewing somebody who had lost 8 family members. A woman who lost her husband and her parents, 5 children, as I recall. So you've got these stories day after day. And it was in some ways a